Welcome, everyone, to the final D2I Presents webinar for this year. And every year we help sponsor typically 4 students from GPS to go to the climate change conferences. This year, those conferences were held in Baku in Azerbaijan, COP29, Conference of the Parties, COP29. Next year, they'll be held in Brazil, COP30. We will send students to Brazil as well. We'll do this event again next year. But it's really my great pleasure to host this. My name is David Victor. I'm a professor of innovation and public policy at GPS. I'm also at the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and with George Tynan, I co-lead the Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which is a joint venture between engineering and GPS. And I'm also a professor at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And Scripps is really the host for the UC delegation going to these climate conferences. It, among other things, runs the Ocean Pavilion with Scripps Institute, with the Woods Hole Oceanographic, phenomenal place where we learn to the oceans. Well, today we're having a little bit of technical difficulties getting our fourth panelist in, but we will get her in just a moment. But I want to introduce our 4 panelists in alphabetical order. So Roberto Hernandez, who's a Master's of International Affairs candidate here at GPS. McKenna Maxwell, who's a Master's in Public Policy, MPP candidate at GPS. Aidan Rosas, who's a Master's in Public Policy and MPP candidate at GPS, and will be joined, I hope, in a little bit, once we sort out the technical issues, by Karina Ruscitti, who is an MPP candidate also from GPS. So a lot of things were in the news about the Baku Climate Conference. I want to begin with a segment talking about the overall picture. Was it a success? Was it a failure? And then I want to talk about what each of the students was doing there, your particular area of focus and interest, and then talk a little bit about the host country and the way it ran, what we learned from its role about international cooperation on climate change. Along the way, we'll have a lot of back and forth, and your job as members of the audience is to get your questions ready. You can ask some questions in a little bit after we have this fireside chat. And I think McKenna, in a little bit, is going to share some photos from the event, but I hope maybe Bev, you can also give McKenna the sharing privileges so that she can also share her screen when we get to that segment. But first, I want to talk about the big picture. So one of the major agenda items this year at the climate conference, the COP29, was to come up with a new target, a new quantified goal for the amount of money that the richer countries should, in various ways, be giving to the poorer countries to help them deal with climate change, both to control emissions, it's often called mitigation, and to deal with the physical effects of climate change, often called adaptation. And the agreement that came out was that there should be ramping up to $300 billion per year of new money going to the developing countries. The current number was $100 billion. That was set way back in 2009. Wasn't quite met by the schedule, but eventually we got there with a little bit of creative accounting. And so we're going from $100 billion to $300 billion a year. That was one of many things on the agenda. A lot of other topics that may come up in the course of today. But I want to start by talking about the big picture. That they got an agreement, is this seen? Do you see this as a success? Do you see this as a kind of paper tiger? And so maybe I'll go to you first, Aidan, with your impressions of the overall success or failure of the climate conference. Aidan?
Hi everyone, it's good to be here. So I think overall I'm um mixed, but hopefully optimistic. Talking to everyone at COP, you sort of really feel the tensions start to rise. I was there the second week, so tensions were already high, and then towards Friday, you know, the negotiators had been up like days at that point. Honestly, kind of surprising you can get a deal done being so sleep deprived. I'm not sure that helps, but
You help. You're
I
the man I know what I'm saying.
yeah. Um, uh, it so leading up to the final day of the COP, I would say it was kind of scary because 300 billion, it was only talked about. The 100 billion goal was only talked about, and at that point, inflation had already made that negligible. Um, and watching the negotiations, you can see the developing countries really get very, very aggravated. Multiple country after country after country is just talking and almost berating developing nations. And being there, you sort of start to feel like, oh, okay, I guess nothing is really going to get done. And maybe this happened at other COPs too, but it was a relief to see that 300 billion happened, especially given I'm not sure if we should name drop here, but there was a very specific country that was constantly I guess sort of trying to delay, and they were really focusing on just arbitrary language within the text and really were dragging out negotiations. And so seeing that one of the developed countries we sort of feel like nothing is going to get happen. So it was a relief that something did end up happening. And it's 300 billion, which is, I think, a much better number than 100.
And you can say the names of the countries that this is, you know, this
Okay,
is
well, it was Saudi Arabia, and they were speaking on behalf of the Arab group. So I think around 70 countries. And they sort of were not they're going against the UAE consensus last year. Um, and we're really focusing on language.
just to make sure everyone
Sorry,
understands, the UAE, the United
100%.
Arab Emirates, they hosted the climate conference last year in Dubai. COP28 was in Dubai, and actually there had not been a country that was lined up to host this year initially, and so the Emirates said, "Hey, we'll do it again." I think the rest of the world wasn't thrilled about that, so then they moved it to Baku. So, and just one last question to you, Aiden, before I go to McKenna for the next comment about the overall success. What do you think is the decision rules here are consensus? So one country that wants to go it alone and is pretty aggressive about it, it can block a whole lot of progress, and you observe that. And they were not acting alone. But what's your sense of the motivation? Why would they, want to slow down the consensus on this number and slow down cooperation on climate change?
So I think there's a lot of sort of political issues at play. I mean, a lot of these countries, they're the people who are in power. Um, a lot of how they got to power is on the backs of fossil fuel money, and I think it's difficult for them to want to commit to getting rid of what they see as the backbone of their country, the backbone of what made their country profitable and brought up the welfare of all of their citizens. And I think at a point it comes back to the citizen is like they think that the only way that, and obviously, this is probably just my opinion, but um, I don't think they want to give up what is making them all that money
Right.
yet.
This is straight up self-interest, as it were, and slowing down progress and so on. Okay. So I want to, Aiden said he is um, hopefully optimistic about the outcome here. And so Aiden is already training for career in diplomacy. So some caveats there. McKenna, seems like you have a different perspective on whether this was, they got to an agreement, so that kept everybody from going home and being unhappy, or they were unhappy but with an agreement. So I'm just curious as to what your impression is of the overall success of this event. And then I'm going to go to Roberto and ask his impression. And Karina, we're going to shift gears with you. I'm asking you to talk about the election. McKenna.
Yes, thank you. Um, just to preface this, both Roberto and I did a brief write-up of our experience with the Institute of the Americas. So I will send a link in the chat for those interested in reading our impressions. I will say, I believe the conversation is going in the right direction. As you know, with Aiden, I have mixed feelings about the outcomes. I don't believe that it was anywhere near the number that is required for developed countries to provide developing countries in light of climate finance and their moral responsibility for providing funding to those who have contributed the least amount to global warming. And so there was sort of a lack of that moral responsibility that we were seeing throughout the conference, and some talk about cumulative emissions versus like historic emissions, and Annex 1 versus non-Annex 1 countries. And we could see, of course,
Annex
know,
1,
these,
for folks at home who don't follow all this stuff closely, Annex 1 is a list of the developed countries because nobody could agree on whether there was an income threshold. So a long time ago, they just wrote them down on a list. That's Annex 1. It's basically the membership of the OECD. And then everyone who's not on Annex 1 is considered a developing country, although folks who are not Annex 1 include countries like Saudi Arabia, very wealthy country, the Emirates, and so on. So these categories have been harder to work, but they still remain diplomatically important.
of course. And so this was 1992 when there was the list of Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 that was created. And since then, of course, we've seen the development of a lot of economies, including China, which, you know, that conversation, you know, in and of itself is that current day is the largest emitter. However, they're still under non-Annex 1 developing, listed as a developing country. And in terms of climate finance, that means that, you know, the previous agreements, the COP processes, do not have them listed as like a contributor to some of these climate finance issues towards developing countries because they themselves are still listed as one. So there was just some more of that like moral responsibility thread that I just wanted to tie back to there in terms of those larger economies that are under contributing or not contributing to the discussions of climate finance.
So I want to just one quick follow-up before I go to Roberto. Is this, I mean, moral responsibility? Fantastic. But we have to get an agreement by consensus. So we're basically observing countries have varying interests. It's hard to get to consensus, and pretty quickly moral responsibility gets lost along the way. One of the things you said to me in our preparations for this event was that you were particularly struck by the lack of active inclusion in this $300 billion number of what's called loss and damage. So basically specialized funds that are to help the least developed countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change, that have contributed in most cases the least to the buildup of greenhouse gases, but are most exposed because of their low income levels and their low resilience, are most exposed to basically the vagaries of the physical effects of climate change. So is that, do you see that as the biggest weakness of the $300 billion deal?
So there is the development of the loss and damage fund, specifically outside of the NCQG $300 billion. That's the national
NCQG,
quantified
the quantified
collective goal.
goal.
And so we see that as of course money that should be included, but just to differentiate here, so loss and damage, typically climate finance could be broken into three categories. Loss and damage is sort of the newest one, but adaptation and mitigation are ones that have, you know, been around for a long time. There's a lot of established funds with various institutions for this, and countries have been contributing to these with previous sort of so like negotiations and the text that we've seen so far. So it is separate in the sense that the loss and damage fund, that is strictly for like the most vulnerable countries to respond to the climate change that is expected to head their way, rather than more of that adaptation and mitigation are more proactive for a wider variety of developing countries to respond and create infrastructure and resilience and adaptation in agriculture and those sorts of methods, renewable energy production and infrastructure and those sorts of things.
So we have this $300 billion a year of new money that's supposed to be flowing, ramping up into the year 2035, I think it is. And then we've got all these other specialized funds that reflect different missions that may or may not actually have any money in them. So loss and damage is a noble mission, but has almost no money in it. So it's hard to be noble when you don't have any money. And so all of this is now going on. And somehow they held Humpty Dumpty together with baling wire and tape, and they got an agreement about this at COP29. So Roberto, I want to bring you into the conversation here. What's your impression of the overall state of political relationships between the highly industrialized countries Annex 1 plus, and then these various developing countries that have different kinds of claims and concerns about the impacts of climate change. What's your overall impression of the state of their relationships?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. And as Aiden and McKenna, I also kind of disappointed with the outcome of COP29 because COP29 show us like a financial discord between global south and global north. As we have mentioned, the original goal was 1.3 trillion dollars. And to put this into perspective, we have to consider that economists have said that we need at least like $4 trillion per year to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And also we have to put some context in this number. No, 1 trillion of dollars equals like 1% of the global GDP. So it's a very feasible financial goal. And also it's like the whole profit of big oil industries for 1 year. So the problem here, I think, is, as McKenna said, is we don't have updated our list of developing nations and developed nations. China is like the second largest economy, and they don't want to contribute to this finance goal to promote like a more equitable outcome for the global south countries. And at the same time, I think the global south authorities and governments, they have to be more proactive because they are just looking for public money from the governments of the global north, for example, from the US and from the European Union. And they are also looking for funds from the finance international organizations like the World Bank. And in this case, there are other alternatives as private finance. For me, the biggest surprise in this COP was the finalization of carbon market rules. One of the most significant breakthroughs was the operationalization of the market-based cooperative implementation of Articles 6.2 and 6.4. This is important because after a decade of intense negotiations, the establishment of rules for high integrity government-backed carbon markets marks a monumental step forward. This is important because this helps to make decarbonization more cost-effective and enhance global mitigation efforts. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to help fill in the pieces here. Article 6 was part of the original Paris Agreement signed at COP21 in 2015. But the process of setting up the detailed rules dragged on forever for Article 6. People affected, many of the rules were agreed and then reopened for this COP. And so folks seem happy that they got finally to rules here that might result in more economic efficiency, might result in more money flowing across borders, including to developing countries. I want to say one more thing about the $300 billion, and I want to go to Karina, which is that they're studiously vague as to what counts. So public money counts, private money counts, money you find in your pocket, I guess, when you put your pants in the dryer, that counts. And so it's part of the reason they could get agreement on the number is because nobody was really clear about the accounting and the accountability. And that was already a problem with the old $100 billion a year goal. It seems like it's going to be an even bigger challenge here. We may come back to that. But Karina, I want to talk with you, get your input on something else that happened right around the time of the COP event, which is the United States had an election. 8 years ago, the United States had an election just as the climate conference was getting underway in Marrakesh, and it was a big shock. And I'm just curious, as someone who's studying in the United States, going with a delegation from the United States to a UN conference in Azerbaijan, what do people say to you about the election, and what do you say back?
So we did get a lot of questions about our thoughts on how the election went and what it's going to mean for the climate and future COPs. We even had like Uber drivers who barely spoke any English be like, Trump, yes, no. So it did get brought up a lot. And after having discussions with people at COP, both from the US and not from the US, my perspective, at least, is that Trump being in office and ending up with the likely withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement as last time he was in office won't ultimately, or at least hopefully, have that significant of an impact on global climate change efforts, only because historically the United States has underdelivered on climate finance commitments to begin with. So the shift may not substantially affect the funds that other countries are putting into the climate crisis, as well as it won't take away from any of the momentum for future COPs. Additionally, I talked to some representatives from the State Department, U.S. State Department, and they were saying that there will still be U.S. representatives at future COPs who will still be participating in bilateral agreements. So it's not like the United States will have, like no involvement at all. It'll just be on a different scale. And domestically, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. Because the last time Trump was in office, the NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council alone, took his administration to court 163 times and won 90% of those cases. So it does give me some hope for his next term, even though, his priority is definitely not climate change.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like if the decision rules in this process are consensus, and you've got a country that now is run by someone who's at least been openly hostile in words to the climate change agenda, and wants to leave Paris, it's better to have them out and not blocking consensus than to have them in, even more damage on the inside. Maybe they'll figure that out and stay in. There is a precedent for this. The United States was never a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It does lots of constructive things on the side as an observer and not a formal member of the treaty. So that may not be the end of the world. But I was very intrigued by your answer, Karina, because basically what you're saying, as I understand it, is the domestic politics in the United States, which includes the use of the courts, the domestic politics, NRDC and other groups suing to enforce statutory interpretation. People are always upset about statutory interpretation being imposed on them when they're in office, and then very happy about it when they're out of office. So that'll happen here. And then you've got various kinds of domestic interest groups that are going to be pushing hard. California announced a special session at the California legislature the day after the election was called. So all kinds of things are happening domestically that'll keep the United States kind of on that track. So that seems like a hopeful vision here. So I want to take a quick round here and get each of you to say a little bit about what you were focusing on specifically as you went to the climate conference. Maybe just do the same order as before. So start with you, Aiden, and then to McKenna.
Yeah, so and that this sort of ties into why I am hopefully optimistic. So I went to
a lot. Hopeful optimism.
I think at a point with all of the negativity, at least mental health wise, it helps to be a little optimistic. So I went to COP to focus on. I really enjoy nature-based solutions, and I enjoy engagement at the community level. So I sort of split COP into like top down and bottom up. Top down is bureaucratic, a little slower, but bottom up is where you really get to see some of the solutions being played out. And so, yeah, nature-based solutions to things like coastal flooding, coastal degradation, land, soil degradation. Me and Karina went to like a methane high-level talk, and they gave some ideas on how to solve organic methane emissions. And I think going to these talks on soil, wildfires, stuff like this, it made me optimistic because I feel like all the knowledge is there, all of the science is there, everything we have, everything that we need to solve climate change is here. It's just is sort of along the implementation pathway. I feel like some sort of blocks and just like slowing down of these, and in this case it's money. A lot of times it is money. People just don't have the money to implement these solutions. But I know me and Karina went to a soil side event, and the lady there talked about how they had like 400,000 farmers in a WhatsApp or a Telegram group chat, all being educated, all being given resources to succeed, how to keep their crops alive in the face of really adaptation measures at that point. But yeah, generally nature-based solutions, community engagement, I saw a lot of it. And that's what made me more optimistic.
Quick question for you on this, which is, so you saw so nature-based solutions, you give a few examples. One of the biggest ones is protecting forests and even naturally regrowing forests to have them reabsorb carbon above ground, below ground biomass, depending on the ecosystem. So are they there looking for permission to do what they're doing? Are they looking for money? Are they just there because everyone else is there and they're just going to keep doing this whether or not they go to a COP conference and tell people about it?
I would say that so a lot of people feel like their issues, their niches, they're not talked about enough. This is a lot of the times with respect to oceans, but with respect to the wildfire, and in this case, it was in the context of cryospheric science. So snow, permafrost, how increasing temperatures are going to affect permafrost, and also how that's going to affect wildfires in the Arctic. So in that context, I think they're going to keep pushing ahead. Because that's all they can do with given how big of an issue, especially in North America, how big of an issue wildfires are. Even though it seems so dire, they did say that they were happy that their issue was getting a little more recognition, a little more. And maybe this happens every COP where people come and they give their spiel, they talk about where the science, where the action is at that moment. And maybe they get a little more optimistic. Their issue gets a little more recognition every time.
McKenna, what were you there to particularly focus on?
Yeah, thank you. So I think coming off of Aiden's comments, it's maybe useful for the audience to understand that there's sort of three different sections of COP. There's the negotiations and the plenary events where the country negotiates are talking about, the text and those COP UNFCCC processes. There are side event rooms where a lot of the researchers are there representing their organizations, their countries, and sort of promoting their progress on some of their climate goals and those sorts of things. And then there's the pavilion space where those countries or NGOs have booths and can talk and have those smaller conversations about promoting their own progress. So I was particularly interested in following the negotiation process regarding loss and damage. So I had over the summer an internship at the UNFCCC in Bonn, where I was working on with the loss and damage unit, going over things like comprehensive risk management, slow onset events, non-economic losses, and human mobility and displacement. And so I was looking to see what sort of progress, first and foremost with the fund, would be had during this conference, and then of course with the new collective quantified goal, which we discussed earlier. And another draw and pull to I really wanted to get to know somewhat more of the research that was being done and attending those side events. And especially was the most impactful one, I think, to me was the Arctic wildfire one, which Aiden had mentioned. And just talking about the amount of carbon emissions from wildfires that are not accounted for in these carbon budgets or the national emissions inventories, because they're seeing wildfires as wild and so not human contributed emissions. However, some of the conversations in that side event were really enlightening to see. Of course, a lot of these wildfires start as agricultural fires. And then you can, of course, pin the increased intensity of heat and drought to, industrialized, emissions, human anthropogenic emissions. And so are they even wild? And that sort of play on words there with, are these emissions, we believe, should be accounted for in some inventory, like they are contributing significantly to carbon emissions annually. And so that was just a really interesting event to see.
Yeah, we have to get the carbon budget right, but it's also a huge accounting challenge since so much of the carbon budget is natural yet perturbed. Karina, I want to go to you next since some of what you were interested in, I think, overlapped with what Aiden was talking about. Then I'll go to you, Roberto. Karina?
Yeah, so I was really following closely, like waste reduction, circular economy, and those types of practices that lead to methane emission reductions. Methane is a lot more potent, for people who don't know, a lot more potent than CO2, even though it's not as abundant. But it also lasts in the atmosphere about 9 to 15 years, while CO2 lasts up to 200. So methane emissions really like kind of pack just like a really strong punch in like a short amount of time. And so there was some focus at this COP on methane reduction, and there was actually a global methane pledge that came to an agreement. It was a 159 countries. They agreed to a goal to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So that was really good news. And a lot of that is through waste reduction practices, organic waste recycling and composting, which is also something that we've been doing in California starting a year or two ago. And then, yeah, so mainly through like policy and then investment in methane reduction. And so, yeah, so luckily, as far as the methane goals, that I think was a pretty successful outcome, as compared to like other finance and loss and damage funding.
Yeah, let me just add, methane is a potent but short-lived gas. Soot, partly from wildfires, but from lots of other activities, even shorter lived, also potent gas. There's a handful of others. Politically, these are very, very interesting, not gas, but particle. Politically, these are very interesting opportunities because they create the potential to have a big impact on slowing the rate of warming, and the benefits appear faster. And one of the challenges in dealing with the climate problem is when you're dealing with carbon dioxide, a well-mixed global pollutant, a stock pollutant, you spend a ton of money right now for an emissions control effort, and the benefits are only appearing far in the future. And so politically, the structure is all out of whack, whereas these other pollutants, it politically are much more, are potentially much more attractive. Roberto, what'd you go there to focus on?
Yeah, well, mainly I was interested in these disparities between global north, global south, and between those countries and the economic inequalities and how those inequalities affect the climate change outcomes, no, for different countries. And also related to this, I was interested on the concept of just transition, and it is this idea of considering all like a multi-stakeholder approach where you consider different voices, interests, not only like the shareholders of the main companies or the authorities or of the governments, but also indigenous communities, a gender approach. That's very important because we want to consider all voices in this global problem. And one comment is that I think we tend to underestimate the role of UNFCCC in and the multilateral framework that we have with COP. We are having like this dramatic change in the international system. In the 90s, we promote the rule-based system, and now we are seeing like the disappearance of these multilateral mechanisms, the destruction of all these institutional frameworks that we have to solve global problems, because we are having like this multipolar confrontation between the US and China that wants to become the next superpower. So I came from Mexico, and I think that it's very important to maintain those institutional breaches because it's the only way that we can dialogue between developed nations and developing countries. Like this is the only institutional mechanism that we have to negotiate, to get like efficient outcomes. We didn't achieve the 1 trillion that we want originally, but we achieved something, no? 300 billion, it's something that we can start beginning with that. And yeah, well, that was my main interest. Thank you.
I want to come back and ask about the UN process and about the hosts, and we'll go to McKenna for that in a second. But let me just quick follow up, Roberto. What's your impression of Mexico's role in the climate diplomacy? The new president of Mexico is a climate scientist before she has her current job, was part of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an institution with which I've spent a lot of my life. We won the Nobel Peace Prize in, I think, 2007. So she knows a lot about climate science. Traditionally, Mexico's been very, very heavily involved. Mario Molina, who passed away a few years ago, a dear friend and colleague of ours here at UC San Diego. Mario was very heavily influenced Mexico's policy on international environmental issues. ozone layer, climate, and so on. So traditionally, there's been this big role for Mexico. What's your impression, Roberto, of the role for Mexico right now?
Well, honestly, I was very disappointed with Mexico in this COP because I had the opportunity to meet the Mexican authorities that came to Azerbaijan during this COP. They organized like a seminar. Um, they tend to focus more on defending this idea that the new government, because the president has like a PhD on energy and she has like research on environmental stuff. That's the only reason we have like as a country to promote this idea that we are taking care of the environmental stuff in our own country. But the reality is that they don't talk about Pemex. Pemex is a national oil company, and it is one of the most polluting companies in the world. And unfortunately, this government is kind of populist. They change the energy reform that the previous government implement. With this reform, the previous government of Peña Nieto, they were trying to modernize the energy sector, to promote green energy transition in the country, to increase like the quantity of green energy solutions. And with the arrival of López Obrador and Morena, there is like a very nationalist and populist movement, political movement in Mexico. They have this archaic vision of what the country should be in the energy sector and environmental sector. They promote like the construction of refineries to increase the production of oil, although that is not like the ideal path that we have to follow as a nation. I mean, we are the 10th largest economy in the world, and we have to accomplish like our own NDC. And I didn't like see like a clear path in that way from the new government. So I have hope that Sheinbaum changes her vision.
Right. And NDC is what's called the nationally determined contribution, which is a fancy way of saying the pledge that each country makes to make its own efforts. This is the genius of the Paris Agreement, is that the agreement is binding, but the individual pledges that each countries make are not binding, to give them a lot of flexibility to figure out what they want to do. And I think, Roberto, your point is emphasizing something that Karina and others were saying earlier, which is and Aiden, that domestic politics explains a lot of the behavior that we observe in what countries are doing, which is hardly surprising. So I want to ask one more question here of you, McKenna. But as I do this, the audience, if you have questions, the deal is you click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Then you'll put your question in the box, and then apparently I ask it on your behalf. So you don't get to raise your hand and get the stage and all the fame and the actors' rights and so on, but you're just going to ask the question. So please get ready, get your questions into the box. I'll ask them in just a moment. But McKenna, I'm just curious about maybe you could lead off here, and then others can chime in if they have impressions. What was your impression of the host country? The way these things work is one government, one UN member, one actually have to be a member of the agreement, member of the Paris Agreement, and the parent agreement, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The host country hosts the event. They organize a lot of the diplomacy. They write the drafts of a lot of the key texts and so on. What was your impression about the job that Azerbaijan did?
Yeah, I think there was overall a sort of disappointment and frustration with the COP29 presidency. There was on Thursday of week 2 that we were there, sort of a first ever event that the presidency led, which was called a Quarrel Tea. And that was sort of a plenary event where every single country was giving their remarks on, feedback as to the current progress of the text. And so usually this is done sort of in a smaller setting, but this event ended up lasting 5 hours. There was a lot of repetition, and this, wasn't being, the progress wasn't happening towards like actually creating new text from all of these sort of complaints, I will say, that were being heard on the floor, the main floor, with all the countries present. And so to many, this sort of seemed like a filibuster event where it was kind of filling time. This is the Thursday before the last day of the conference when all the texts are due. And of course, everyone's running behind, no, not behind schedule, but there's just disagreements. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I think some of the takeaways for COP29 was sort of this trust among nations was shaken a little bit, and that could be impartially due to how the presidency was handling the conference and the events here. And of course, you know, we mentioned Saudi Arabia was one of the countries sort of asking for a lot of text to be removed. You know, the United States in the smaller discussions was also sort of culprit to this, putting everything in brackets. You know, they negotiate these line items sentence by sentence, and you know, when they put something in brackets, it means they're taking it out of the text. And these are some of them, you know, the things that were taken out were the specifics on who's financing, how the financing will happen. And so the end result of this being taken out is a very vague sort of understanding of how to move forward with this. And there were some delays and, you know, postponements of a few decisions until next year. So there's no agreements on some of these texts, including related to loss and damage financing, which was postponed 6 months until the subsidiaries bodies meeting in June. And so some of the delays there were kind of linked back to the COP29 presidency.
Yeah, and some of this is normal. For example, Roberto mentioned that finally we got this year agreement on Article 6, even though Article 6 is now almost 10 years old. So you know, it's nearly at the point where it's going to get its driver's license, and that the way they dealt with disagreements, ongoing disagreements with Article 6, was they just kept delaying and delaying and delaying, and then actually when they delayed and then there were more disagreements, they reopened old texts. And so you put all that together and you have a recipe for kind of not getting a lot done. But it does seem like this was pretty extreme. There was this famous case just before the end of the conference where the Azeri hosts issued the document on the new quantified goal, the $300 billion goal, had no numbers in it. So I guess that was revealing of how deep the disagreements were. Just very quickly, I don't know if Aidan, Karina, or Roberto, you have any comments about the host before I go to some of the questions that are online.
I have a quick comment. So, you know, just quickly, I thought after being there and then sort of looking back on week one, the very beginning speech by Aliyev, by the Azerbaijani president, I don't think that he didn't really play a neutral role. I do support calling out the hypocrisy of Western nations, of course, but then he said oil is a gift from God, all natural resources are gifts from gods, but I don't think he played the neutral role that he should have, and the role that is necessary to bring countries together. Instead, he sort of took like a pitted role of being between two opposite sides instead of trying to bring everyone together. I just think that's sort of an important note.
You think, Aidan, do you think that there ought to be tougher standards on countries that host? I mean, Azerbaijan was under a lot of criticism. Early on, they basically didn't involve any women in the planning process. Someone tapped them on the shoulder and said, we don't do that anymore. So they changed their behavior. There's a long-standing animosity with Armenia, and really truly outrageous and atrocious things have happened there. And so there's a lot of reasons why maybe not the ideal host, but there also weren't a lot of other countries raising their hands saying we wanted to do this, to the point where the Emiratis were actually offering to host it again, if they wanted to. So do you have a sense of whether there ought to be tougher standards on countries before they were allowed to host an event like this?
You know, I think it's hard because the purpose of COP is to bring everyone together. And you know, for people who don't know, there's a rotational selection. So there's like it goes from like Asia to the Middle East to Latin America to Europe, something like that. And in this case, it
Just
yeah,
like
there's
football.
yeah. And in this case, it
Real
was
football.
um, you know, honestly, I'm not sure, but I do like generally, I think there are standards that we should adhere to. And if a country doesn't want to adhere to them, or in this case, maybe they said they would, but they went back on it. These ideas of like environmental justice and inclusion. Didn't seem like they hit the mark on that one. I think maybe in the face of these happenings, maybe countries should actually implement tougher standards to make sure this doesn't happen. This was a weird situation because Russia was like, I'm not accepting anyone who supports Ukraine. So they sort of had to go with Azerbaijan. I don't know. I think that's a difficult question. Like, yeah, there probably should be.
I think-
Roberto, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I think there should be like a minimum standard because I mean, Azerbaijan has like a very very known history of human rights violations. It's an authoritarian regime. It was very interesting because when we were walking like next to the lake, you can see in the sea like oil. It was like very polluted, like the city, the air, the water. So it was kind of, I don't know, like a shocking experience for me personally.
I want
And-
to,
yeah.
Karina, did you want to say something about this? I want to get one of our questions in, then I want to ask McKenna to show us a few photographs from the scene.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, there was definitely some clear like greenwashing that the country tried to do. They had like these waste bins that were like trash recycling, compost, like organics, just like in the streets, not even in the venue, but just in Baku itself. And then you look inside and it's all just trash. And it just seems like they were doing a lot of things just to appeal to the people coming to their country for COP, but in reality, I don't think that's how they actually operate. And once people aren't there for COP anymore, is any of the sustainable stuff that they're doing now really going to continue? It's kind of questionable.
And let me just mention that there's a question in the Q&A by Jenny Brandon about so many hosts in a row that are large oil producing countries. So we had Egypt, we had last year we had the Emirates in Dubai. This year we have Baku. We have Brazil, which is like a substantial oil producer, but Brazil also involved in a lot of carbon emissions related to deforestation. All of that, maybe that's changing now with a new government. My view on this, and then I want to ask a different question in just a second. My view on this is that I actually think this is good. I think that it's pretty important to have these events at places whose actual behavior needs to change. One of the things that was really striking at COP28, I didn't go to COP29, but I went to COP28 in Dubai, was that you went through the free trade zone industrial area to get to the climate conference. And so you saw lots of combined cycle natural gas plants. You saw an aluminum smelter. They had erected a temporary wind turbine as well. So you kind of saw a wind turbine, but it was really striking to see all of those facilities on your way to a climate conference. There's only so many climate conferences you can host in Denmark without kind of missing the point that making big reductions globally is going to require more than just Denmark. Question I want to put to the panel right now, and then I want to ask, maybe put it to you, Aidan, or you can punt it to somebody else if you prefer. $300 billion. How'd they get this number? Did they have a dartboard, Ouija board? It's bigger than 100, it's smaller than $1 trillion, but $300 billion a year. Where'd that number come from?
Um,
I want to talk about, Karina, do you want to tell us where that number came from?
Yeah, so I don't think, or at least I'm not 100% sure where that number came from, because that number actually wasn't even decided on until that last day where negotiations were closed. For the rest of COP, or at least that second week we were there, they were trying to get an agreement on 230 billion. So we actually didn't even realize that 300 was in the picture until after the negotiations were all said and done. So I'm not sure about that. The 230, also not sure. All I know is that in the negotiations we were able to listen to, there were some countries who were even trying for there to be no set number goal, and just not even putting a number to it. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that number did change at the very end.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody else has a quick comment on that before. McKenna, why don't you put the slides up while
Okay.
Aidan says a couple of things about his impression.
Yeah, I was doing a little bit of research earlier on the sort of idea of debt burden and all of those things with respect to least developed countries. And I think there are some scientific papers, some research out there that sort of estimate what we could do annually. And I think 300 billion Unfortunately I've been looking, I can't exactly find. I was literally just reading about this, but I do think that there are some at least some research out there that suggests that 300 billion is actually below-ish what we could do annually, theoretically. So maybe it comes from a paper, I'm assuming from some research.
Yeah, there's a study that Nick Stern at LSE and Amara Bhattacharya, my colleague at Brookings, did that had a significant impact. Well, may have had a significant impact in putting some numbers on the table. But I think just to echo what Karina said, the number 300 was not a magical number. It's bigger than 100 by a lot and smaller than a trillion. And beyond that, it was a horse trading operation. McKenna, why don't you give us a quick overview of what we're seeing here? Right now, we're seeing that we have to pay up. I think you're going to show us a few pictures, and then I'm going to go to another question from the audience.
Okay. Really quickly, I think to the last question, the 1.3 trillion was really being pushed by developing countries, and a lot of research is showing that that's the number that's needed annually. But the 300 billion was supposed to be only public financing contributing towards 1.3, and that ended up being all financing, innovative,
Because the agreement is
etc.,
very clear
private,
that it's everything counts.
and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about these
So
pictures.
yeah, there was a specific space within the venue where every day there was a climate protest sort of space. And this includes sort of like the fossil fuel treaties. They had sort of gave awards to the best of the worst countries every day of COP. So they would give, awards to who was the worst at negotiating or blocking progress on climate.
And they're called the fossil of the day, and they gave the last fossil of the day to the host government.
Yes.
Epic
Yes.
move. Okay.
So this is just one of the other demonstrations here, paying up for the loss and damage fund. Just some photos from inside one of the meeting rooms. This was the deferment, postponement. It lasted 15 minutes, this meeting, to everyone agreed to postpone the loss and damage, one of the texts for loss and damage to the summer of 2025. This is just a video of the same room. Sorry, just to give you context of what
This is an action
everyone's
video.
listening in on these. This is the line by line items that are being negotiated for the new collective quantified goal text. There's screens everywhere, and you can see the brackets being put in real time on countries that are asking things to get removed or added to the text.
We by the way, we did this in the IPCC final plenary sessions, and it was literally negotiating by a committee of 200 with the text up on the screen.
Just a photo of the four of us there on one of the first days. And some of the side events, they have all charts and graphs and talking about, of course, this is relevant for the next COP in Brazil, which will be a large focus on deforestation. And so there has been progress incrementally, towards lowering those deforestation rates in the Amazon, for example. Every morning there was a meeting for the researchers. Ringo is what it was called, and so this sort of briefing that they were giving in the morning on the progress of literally the text that was released at 2 a.m. the previous or that same morning, sort of giving us an overview of what the latest and greatest was. This is specifically referring to Article 6, carbon markets. This is showing burnout at the cafeteria. Just someone kind of already having too much going on with the conference, taking a nap. This is just a short video of entering the arena. They have this music that sounds like you're entering Disneyland. I don't know if you can hear it.
No, we can't hear it, but that's okay.
Just to give some context there on the outside of the venue. This was all inside the stadium. There was 0 windows. We had no idea what time of day it was. Anywhere inside the venue also had pretty poor ventilation. I think one of the alumni that we met with told us there was like heightened levels of like CO2 in the building because they weren't getting enough oxygen, and that was maybe causing some more burnout because of the lack of clean air in the building. And of course, Roberto standing in front of the Energy, Industry, and Just Transition Board, and me in front of the Adaptation and Loss and Damage. More selfies, and this was the last meeting with 2 GPS alumni that were at the conference. I don't know if you want to get into photos of Baku, but briefly, this
There was
was
a
our
couple of
view
Baku, and then I want to ask another question of the whole team.
Okay, view from our balcony onto this park that, of course, it was kind of new for the conference, but some beautiful architecture in Old Town. Like a memorial for the Azerbaijan and Armenia conflict, which, of course, like we were saying, human rights violations and those sorts of things. So these are just some general photos of the town.
Great, thank you very much. I want to ask a couple more questions before we wrap up here. First, I want to ask. We got a question from Martina Paruch in the chat here about the pledges, and she wants to know what happens if countries don't meet their pledges. You know, does the Secretary General of the UN show up and say naughty, naughty, naughty? How are they enforced? And I guess I want to ask you a variant of this question, which is there more talk at this conference about the problem of countries pledging a whole lot and they're not doing what's needed to meet the pledges? What's your impression of that? Does anyone want to comment on that issue?
I'll take a quick stab, and this is something that's going on currently in the International Court of Justice. Small island developing state Vanuatu and other Pacific islands have brought this to the International Court. And so currently 15 judges have just heard written and oral arguments from over 100 countries regarding this issue, specifically what are countries obligated to under international law to protect the climate and the environment from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and what are the legal consequences for governments when their acts or lack of action have significantly harmed the climate or environment. So those are the 2 questions that this ICJ court is trying to, is deliberating on, and those deliberations will probably, the advisory opinions are expected in early 2025. So, but currently under UNFCCC.
One consequence is the ICC is mad at you.
I'm sorry.
And one consequence is the ICC says adverse things about behavior.
Right. So there's currently, as you said, these are voluntary sort of contributions and NDCs. So if anything, slap on the wrist, but there's no real leveraging power to kind of go against anyone who has not, countries who have not obligated their expenses.
Let me ask another question about the national obligations, and somebody else might want to take this, and also if you have additional comments on beyond what McKenna said. So there's a question in here from Dumas Zhang about whether the outcomes of COP29 have an impact on what important countries do back at home after COP29, like the United States, like China. And so do any of you have comments on whether that impact exists there? What are the best cases? What did you observe? Any thoughts about this?
Well, there is no enforcement mechanism to accomplish like all countries obey the new agreement, no? So that's like the main problem and the main challenges. And I think also that we cannot ensure like countries like Russia or the US are going to be accountable of their actions. Honestly, the US can do whatever they want because they have the power to do it. So if Trump wants to take the US out of the Paris Agreement, he can do it. That's the main issue with this kind of multilateral institutions. They cannot enforce, they cannot obligate countries to do what they should do. Yeah, that's my take.
Okay. I want to ask you, Aidan, and then I'm going to come to a final question, which is a zinger from Jeff Myers, former GPS student, very good at the zingers, which is about the biggest surprise for each of the panelists coming out of this. But I want to just follow up a little bit, maybe with you, Aiden, about what Roberto just said, which is you got all these pledges. There's no real enforcement mechanism. A lot of countries, if anything, are backsliding. You gave the example of Mexico. Yet you're hopefully optimistic. Did you, when you came out of this process, did you have more optimism about how the machinery of the UN actually gets cooperation on climate change than when you went in?
I mean, I think coming in, I guess coming in, I felt like things would go a little bit faster. And I think it's understandable that tension and disagreement is what kind of lengthens discussions. But it almost seems like I'm not sure. I honestly, I think I was I think getting clarity on how everything worked definitely gave me a little more optimism, because I think the unknown, uh, there's just no clarity with how things work. I did think it was going to go a little bit faster. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that seeing how it worked changed much for me or getting more clarity. I think um, having taken like political science classes, we sort of know that bureaucracy is slow, and that these like good things take a lot of time. So I was sort of expecting that. I think what I wasn't expecting is how how much tension there was going to be between the global north, global south, developed, least developed countries. I think that was something that I wasn't really expecting.
Yeah, I think that's emerging as one has been latent for the whole process, but that will be the big fault line for potential future. But I'm always a little surprised when they get to agreements at these conferences, because the ability of some countries to just take their ball and go home, which has happened once in 2009 in Copenhagen, where developing countries, a group of smaller developing countries said, we're not going to agree. And they just left and there was no final agreement. That's happened only once so far. It's actually pretty impressive. You had 29 events and one event that didn't produce actually a diplomatic agreement. Okay, so final question from Jeff Myers, and you can blame him if you think it's too much of a zinger, but what's the biggest surprise that you saw from this whole experience of getting ready for and going to and then coming back from Baku? Who wants to start?
I can start. So for me, I think what surprised me the most is the process of negotiating the agreement text. Like McKenna was saying, they just like bracket things they want removed, and then they also like discuss, like each country will share their opinion, what they want added, what they want taken out. I'm going line by line, and it was crazy to me the amount of, I guess, like negotiating and like arguing that went over like a simple like comma or like a period. And some of this was done strategically to slow the process down and to get people, so frustrated that they just come to an agreement. But yeah, just the process, it was really just going line by line. They get tripped up on like the smallest details. It had a lot of parallels to local government, which was also surprising to me because I work for the city of San Diego, and I've gone to meetings where they're drafting regulatory texts for different policies, and similar, you have people making their opinions known, expressing what they feel about it through public comments. But of course, the key difference is that in local government, you have an agency that can make the final decision to regulations as they see fit. Whereas on a multilateral level, it's all consensus based, which is not the most efficient for coming to like a good agreement. But yeah, just the whole process was surprising to me.
Okay, who wants to go next? Thank you.
Well, my biggest surprise is self-evident, but for me, the biggest surprise was this capacity of humans to dialogue from there were people from all over the world, from different countries, and it's amazing to see all these people from different backgrounds, cultures, languages, to be able to discuss and negotiate like a global agreement. That's amazed me a lot more in this context of the rising far right and these intolerant ideologies.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary when you think about it.
I can go next. Sort of not necessarily super broad, but going back to that like protest area, fossil of the day, at one point they gave it to Russia for conducting oil and gas deals in their pavilion. I guess I sort of maybe naively came in thinking that everything was going to be super rosy, super focused, all about climate change. And I guess I found it surprising that some people were there just to advance national interests around fossil fuels. I didn't get any info on who Russia was talking to, but I found it a little disheartening, a little surprising. I was like, oh, what are we here for if like some people are just here to keep increasing profits and making money on fossil fuels? That was pretty surprising. Like kind of brazen right out in the open. I was like, well,
Thank you.
Yeah,
McKenna?
I'll finish up. I'm definitely agreeing with Aiden on being surprised at how many fossil fuel lobbyists were present at this conference and at the previous COP conference, COP28 in Dubai. I would expect not so many fossil fuel interests to be present at this conference, but since these last two are hosted in petro states, it's also not surprising. But I think that they outnumbered the actual representatives from countries. I think there was like over 1,000 or 2,000 fossil fuel lobbyists. But I would say that what was most impactful for me was being there in person, seeing representatives from small island developing states, seeing indigenous people there, really sort of fighting for what they believe is necessary for their survival, and then seeing it sort of thrown to the sidelines in a way. So I feel like that was really impactful to see.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question partly to help answer John Uhr's question that just came in from in the Q&A box. I've been surprised at how long it's taken for the diplomacy to really focus on the physical impacts of climate change. So much of the discussion is still about controlling emissions, as it should be for the long term. But meanwhile, the physical impacts are growing. We're making a lot of progress in the climate problem overall, but not enough to stop warming at 2 degrees. We're going to have some significant physical impacts, and the least developed, the most vulnerable countries will be hit hard. And that's very clear in all the work that's been done by the reviewed by the IPCC and many of the other studies, individual studies. And as the diplomacy focuses more on this, we're going to have the risks of gridlock are going to go up, because these are areas where very wealthy countries and very poor countries really have fundamental disagreements, and there are significant moral and economic obligations. And we're not really dealing with those at the scale at the scale needed. So I'm always surprised that somehow the diplomats pull out an agreement in almost all these conferences, even though sitting below the surface, there are some pretty big fissures, especially between the richest countries and the poorest countries. But that is indeed the job of a diplomat, which is to get people to agree even when they don't agree. I want to close our meeting today with 2 things. First, I want to give some thanks to our 4 terrific panelists, GPS students all, and as part of this wonderful delegation that Scripps organizes every year. Big thanks to Rob Monroe, the funders at Scripps, to Margaret Linen for the work that they all do to help to include us. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Bev Fruto, for running the webinar and organizing that today. And I want to thank also the audience that has been with us and asking smart and far-ranging questions. That's the first thing. Second thing, I want to wish everybody a good break. We're coming up at the end of the quarter, and it's such a pleasure to have this event every year. And also, I wish you some good time off, and look forward to seeing everyone back in the classroom in January. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
thank you, everyone.